That's a lot.
Yeah, I know which one. So it's almost like.
We're moving. Oh, yeah. For a mirror. Fill in the blanket in the back. I can think I got 50 cents.
50 cents.
Yeah.
Plus.
How old are you gonna live to be?
It's right, well, I'm not very old.
50 cents is not
I probably have. But do you have the
Do I
time?
have the desire to
Do you really want to know?
Wait, if I can wait till I'm now.
Thanks, I needed that. But I needed a penny. Oh, yeah.
She may take since it's
So it's like sacrilegious to leave it there, right?
close enough, I can.
Then there's that, and what you really gotta get home.
And I think they're not making them anymore.
It costs like 3 cents a piece to make.
You guys have planned for some, aren't you down?
Or just think about something silly. I'm only in kindergarten, I figured that one out.
See, there's a bar. I know you.
I'll just take it out.
Apparently, I'm no better at getting started on time than anybody else.
What's your middle name, Andy?
Yes. Control.
You guys are going to have to help me out today because my hearing is starting to go. So no whispering among yourselves.
How's your back? That's part of the problem. Oh, I'm sorry. And the other ladies are okay.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Are we all alert and alive and ready to begin? Let me rephrase that. Are you? I know I'm not. Okay, Steve is gone today, in case you hadn't figured that out. See if I can reorient myself so that I can almost see everybody. Oh, that's the other thing I should tell you about, these glasses. You know, if you're at the edge of my vision, I can't see you. But if you've got something to say, you're going to have to say it because I probably won't notice. Okay. This is only intended to be a 1 week thing. So normally I wouldn't take on anything too complicated for a one-time class, because we probably won't get to follow up on it if I let it run away with us. But I was looking over some old lesson material. That's what you do when you get old. You don't learn new things. You work on the old ones. Anyway, it occurred to me that even simple stories in the Bible can produce some pretty deep discussions. So today I actually want to talk about some, I'll call them weighty subjects. God's plans, for one, and men's free will, and the consequences of going along with evil. All in the context of Israel's exodus from Egypt. That's the nominal subject. When I covered this material a few years back, somebody in the class said it was God's plan for the Israelites to be in Egypt for those 400 years. I'm not going to agree or disagree with that, but I do want to point out that it can be tricky to distinguish between events that God himself brings about, frequently in spite of what men can do, and those that are due to men's intentions that he works to his own ends. And the history of the children of Israel appears to me to have some elements of both those things. And God's miracles are clear examples of his intervening in the natural order, shall we say. Man had nothing to do with the Israelites being able to cross the Red Sea, for example. But Joseph tells his brothers in Genesis chapter 45, verses 5 and 7, that God sent me ahead of you. And in verse 8, he goes so far as to say, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Now, did God tell him that, or did he figure it out on his own? The text doesn't say. But if you were to take that to mean God forced this to happen, but it wouldn't have otherwise, then did God cause Joseph's brothers to hate him? Or did God make them sell him into slavery? I don't know about you, but I'm not comfortable with either one of those ideas. So, here's the first question. Given that Joseph told his brothers, it wasn't you who sent me here, but God, what do you suppose God did do? Yeah, I figured that was going to get a slow start. Because the fact of the matter is, we are not told, which is something you're going to have to keep in mind in all of this discussion. But Joseph said it to his brothers. You didn't send me here, God did. What did God do? Carol?
Well, in the New Testament, tells us that he works all things for the good to those that love the Lord.
Right.
So, although he knows what we're going to choose, we always have the ability to choose something else.
Yeah.
So he knew what the brothers were going to choose.
That's what I would say exactly, in fact. For example, God could have put into Judah's head to sell him into slavery instead of killing him. And it clearly would have taken not a lot of effort on God's part to bring Joseph to Egypt, knowing what his brothers were like and what they were going to do. So, however he did that, the end result is that Joseph came to Egypt as, shall we say, part of God's plan. But that's not the same thing as saying God made his brother sell him into slavery.
Well, and it could be also that the Holy Spirit put those words in Joseph's mouth.
Yeah. Okay,
give him an understanding.
I won't deny that possibility. Joseph understood somehow that it was God's intention that he be in Egypt, that these things would happen. Now, how he got that knowledge, we have no clue. How about that 400-year sojourn in Egypt? Maybe I missed it, but I don't find anything that says God intended them to be slaves and to suffer, or even that he necessarily wanted the 400 years to happen. He told Abram in Genesis 15, verse 13, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions." So did God want them to be enslaved and mistreated? And in particular, did this happen because they disobeyed God, as happened to the Israelites so often later on? I don't see anything to say that that's the case. It happened, and God rescued them, and God punished the Egyptians for doing it. And the punishment and the rescue were clearly God's doing. His miracles attest to that. The rest of it, in my mind, probably comes under the heading of what Carol said a minute ago. God working all things for the good of those who love him. Paul wrote that to the Romans. But put on your wild speculation hat, because that's what we're doing here in effect, and tell me this. Since God presumably could have rescued them anytime he wanted to, why do you suppose he waited 400 years until they were suffering so greatly? Anybody have a theory?
Well, one is that it would bring what was told years before to fruition.
Yeah, it was certainly a fulfillment of what God had said. Of course, now you get into this which is the chicken and which is the egg loop. But, okay, I don't know either. I'm not going to pretend I do. But God wanted a people who would become a nation, more than just a few of Abraham's descendants. And he wanted them to depend on him. He makes that clear over and over. And their stay in Egypt multiplied them. It kept them together as a body, and it gave them a shared history that they never really lost. And they were totally dependent on him.
It seems to me that, over that 400 years, the Israelite population really increased.
Oh, yes.
But they needed a lot of people if they were going to go in and possess the land that God intended for them to inherit.
Sure.
You couldn't do that with the number of people that went down there.
Yeah, they started out with Jacob and his 12 sons. Well, 13, whatever. 12. And their families. So, yeah, no ragtag bunch of nomads was going to take over the land of Canaan as God intended. That's the point. Yes, sir.
Old Testament says that God delayed until the sin of the Canaanites was right.
Good point. Yeah. So there was an element of that also. God was waiting, as usual, for the right time. And the right time was the time when apparently he felt the Canaanites needed to be displaced.
It's also
And the
new generations that are there, and maybe a fresh start or better perspective.
Yeah, as it happens, they don't get a fresh start. Since none of the men who left Egypt actually made it into the promised land. Well, I don't think there's any grounds for saying that God should have done that differently somehow. It's just one of those questions that occurred to me. Now, with all that in mind, let's take a look at the subject of God's role in the hardening of the heart. There are 13 references to that in Exodus, Three of them describe Pharaoh as hardening his own heart. One of those also describes his officials as hardening their own hearts. And the other 10 passages credit God as doing it and give various explanations as to why he did so. The obvious one to look at is in Exodus 9 and the beginning of Exodus 10, because both sides of this story occur within 3 verses there. We'll read starting in Exodus 9, verse 34. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials, so that I may perform these miraculous signs of mine among them, that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and how I performed my signs among them, and that you may know that I am the Lord." Now, the previous time when I brought this up, about half the class tried to answer the question of why God did this before I even asked it. So today I'm not going to ask that specific question, because however persuasive your or my reasoning might be on this subject, it'll come down to reason, not revelation. So if you want to talk about God's motives, the Bible tells us what happened, but the hows and frequently the whys usually have to be inferred. And we need to keep that clearly in mind as we have this discussion. We are working in inference here. Now, the passage I just read, the text says, Pharaoh and his officials hardened their hearts, and then 2 verses later, it says, God says, I did it. So they both did it, whatever it was. And the text tells us little or nothing about the how of what God's part was. We're taking as I think as a given that God did something here. Exodus quotes him 4 times as saying so. What we do know about is the end result. Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go over and over. And verse 34 says he sinned again. Now, I assume nobody here is likely to say that God made him sin. But to put some perspective on this, let's think back to the account in Exodus chapter 1, which describes how the children of Israel got to the point they needed delivering. So did Pharaoh really need a change to his heart in terms of his attitude toward the Israelites? Was he a benevolent ruler that God turned into a tyrant? Let me put that in words of very, very small number of syllables. Was he treating the Israelites nicely? You're talking about a man who the scriptures say oppressed them, then made their lives bitter with hard labor, and tried to have all their male children murdered at birth. That's the heart we're talking about here. So what's the likelihood that when Moses showed up and told the Pharaoh of Egypt, God says, let my people go, that his reaction would have been, sure, why not?
Not very well.
Yeah, I'd say little or no possibility. He was in effect the most powerful man on earth at that point. His authority was absolute, and at this point in history, he was largely regarded as a god. Now, he's described as not knowing about Joseph, and nobody's quite sure what that means, but he could have been one of the Egyptian rulers who came to power by murder or conquest rather than by inheritance. So maybe he didn't know about their history. He certainly would not have been expected to give in to Moses' demand when it was first made. But as the plagues got worse and worse, he still didn't give in. So let's talk about why. How many reasons can you think of, possible reasons, for why Pharaoh was unwilling to give in to Moses' demand in spite of the plagues.
Economy. Economy.
Economy, yes, that's a good one. After they were allowed to leave, Pharaoh says in Exodus 14, verse 5, "What have we done? We have lost their services." There could have been as many Israelites as Egyptians at this point. At least the Egyptians were worried that that might happen. They're doing all the really hard work. The economy of the southern U.S. collapsed after the Civil War, at least in part because of the loss of all that slave labor. And it's not that unreasonable to expect that was going to happen here too. So that's a big deal. Clearly, there's a big economic incentive for Pharaoh to keep the Egyptians, as the Israelites, as slaves to the Egyptians. What else? Jonathan?
There's the old axiom, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
So when Pharaoh gets to that point where he believes he's a god, and there's probably other people in history that we can point to that just doesn't believe or will accept that they can be defeated, or that any other quote unquote god or entity could beat them and force them into making a decision. So no matter how bad it hurts the people, his own people, or his country, he's not going to be willing to give in.
Sounds an awful lot like a certain Russian ruler one could think of at the moment, for example. Yeah, there's a whole list of, I will say, personal characteristics here that we can infer from the Pharaoh's actions. Pride, arrogance, stubbornness, look who I am. And there's the humiliation of having to give in to a bunch of slaves.
Well, and from what I understand, each plague challenged one of their gods.
Yeah, that's at least a theory that's been postulated.
And if so, and Pharaoh's thinking he's God, then he's going to come out even though the other gods are dropping like flies.
Yeah, the Egyptian gods, so to speak, had never been defeated in Egyptian history to speak of. Even the rulers who came to rule Egypt by conquest still worshiped the Egyptian gods. So, yeah, that'd be a pretty bitter pill to swallow. And I got to say, autocratic leaders in general, as I think Jonathan was pointing out, have a really hard time admitting that people they think of as powerless can actually affect what they do or what they want to do. Well, there's one other possibility, the simplistic one, which is a literal view of what it means for God to harden Pharaoh's heart. This has seemed to some people to say, well, he didn't really have a choice because God hardened his heart. If you put it that way, that would seem to imply a couple of things, at least to me. One is that God took away his free will, so it wasn't really his fault. And the second is that he would have done something different if God hadn't done whatever he did. Now, does either one of those seem like a real possibility to somebody? Well, certainly doesn't to me. I mean, that view seems to be contradicted by the other passages that say Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Whatever God is doing, Pharaoh is not being driven to do something that is in any way against his nature or his own inclinations. It fits right in with the man he is and what he wants. Okay, let's look at another aspect of this question. If you go back to the middle of Exodus chapter 9, starting in verse 13. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning, confront Pharaoh, and say to him, 'This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. For this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and your officials and your people, so you may know there's no one like me in all the earth. For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I've raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. You still set yourself against my people and will not let them go. Now, both the King James and the NIV use the phrase raised you up with respect to what God said he did for Pharaoh. And one possible interpretation of this is, I made you the Pharaoh just so I could demonstrate my power, which in effect could amount to God saying, I set you up so I could knock you down. If that's what he meant, then again, one might say on behalf of Pharaoh, well, it's not all his fault that this is happening. He's just God's puppet. Is that what this passage is saying? Sounds plausible on the surface, but in fact, the New American Standard Translation renders the end of this passage like this. But indeed, for this cause, I have allowed you to remain in order to show you my power and in order to proclaim my name through all the earth. The Hebrew word that's translated raised up or allowed to remain is actually rendered in about 40 different ways in various translations. But the gist of most of them is to be allowed to do or be something. So God says, I've left you in power because I want you to see my power. So tell me this, why do you suppose God would do that? I'll be provocative and ask, is he showing off?
I think God wanted to show that he's the one who did it. You've
Right.
got slaves, the lowest class of people in what was probably the predominant nation in the world at the time. And God says, I'm going to do something impossible, and everyone's going to see it.
Right. It's a message.
Is that showing off out of vanity? No. But
No.
he is showing off, I'm much more powerful than the most powerful Pharaoh.
This is who I am. Yeah.
And he's sharing, sorry, Dad, and he's sharing with his people who he is, so
This is also true. He's showing this to his own people. Doug?
Well, and that's what Paul says in Romans 9. What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy.
Good point.
And he knows his power to also show his mercy to those whom he has.
Right. In fact, there's one of the times when Moses decides to dispute with him about God's thinking he's going to wipe them all out is basically the message that will send to the people around them. So it's all tied in there together. Now, Jonathan?
Yeah, I don't know so much about showing off.
Gods are allowed to show off, by the way.
Yes, he can do that for sure. But when I look at the God that I worship, he is a God that is constantly wanting all men to come to him, and that is shown many times in the Old Testament through his power and his ability to raise kingdoms up and then bring them down, and by the power that he shows, others, when they see that, will come to him. It makes me think of Daniel, and how one of the one and only time, not one and only, but one of the only times that I know of in the Bible where a secular evil king, Nebuchadnezzar, writes a chapter in the Bible. And that's really interesting to me, that he saw the power of God and basically worshipped God. And it's a pretty amazing chapter when you read it. I wish I could remember exactly which chapter it is, but God showing his power and freeing the Israelite people, if it shows the nation of Egypt who God is, God wants the nation of Egypt to be part of his kingdom as well. Instead of worshiping multiple gods, to worship him. And
Yeah,
so
that's-
not necessarily showing off in that instance, but to show his power so that others will come to him.
Yeah, that's another really good point. Now, I'm going to say, I don't think God ever had any real hope of getting Pharaoh to see the light. But I would at least suggest, and I think this is in line with what Jonathan said, that he wants the Egyptians to recognize him also. And in the best of all possible worlds, by now they would have started to get the message. Have any of them done so? Do the Egyptians get the message?
You do see that some of his assistants, officials, were encouraging, has enough damage already happened?
Yeah,
They were listening to what was being
If
told.
nothing else,
And preparing.
they absolutely recognize God's power. And when the plague of hail is predicted at the end of this passage we've been looking at, verse 20 says, those officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord hurried to bring their slaves and their livestock inside. So some of them have enough regard for God and certainly for his power to take Moses' warning at face value and prepare for what's coming. They believe it. And after this plague, Pharaoh himself shows his first, maybe only sign, I'm not sure, of something like remorse. When he says in verse 27, this time I have sinned, the Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. But of course, when the plague stops, he changes his mind again. But in chapter 10, verse 7, Pharaoh's officials said to him, how long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not realize that Egypt is ruined? So the officials at least are convinced of God's power, and they see the consequences of continuing to oppose him. There's no more talk of them hardening their hearts. Okay, we'll probably beat this horse long enough. I do want to address one other point that creates a problem for some people. About the poor Egyptian people in all this? They're the ones who bear the brunt of the plagues. Why do they have to suffer? Because their ruler is arrogant and stubborn. Why couldn't God have just picked on Pharaoh himself from the beginning? Well, I'm going to tell you my view, which is that's the way the world works. People always suffer from the mistakes of their leaders, whether they had a choice in choosing them or not, which the Egyptians didn't. And again, if you consider God as really trying to show the Egyptian people who the ruler of the universe really is, it raises another question. Just how innocent, in fact, are the Egyptians when it comes to the Israelites? What's their relationship like?
My guess is that their relationship to the Israelites is about the same as our relationship to the blacks 100 years ago.
Yeah, that's a good parallel. Remember back in Exodus chapter 1, the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. And in all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean every Egyptian was personally responsible for oppressing the Israelites. In fact, when they leave Egypt, many of the Egyptians are favorably disposed toward them and give them all kinds of stuff. But the fact is, their whole society benefited from the treatment of the Israelites. The Egyptians were the slave owners. So you have a situation kind of analogous to, say, the South in the Civil War, where a whole lot of people are going to wind up suffering greatly because of a situation they hadn't personally created, but had accepted and benefited from overall. Okay, well, ultimately we come back to the fact that God chose to make an example of a hard-hearted Pharaoh and the Egyptian people in the course of freeing his people. What kind of lesson does that have for us today? What's that got to do with me? Susan?
To recognize that God's in control of the entire world in regards to what's going on in the world situation, nationally or personally with each one of us. We can trust God completely. And to kind of look at the big picture from God's standpoint and not get bogged down with what happens day to day in the world.
Excellent point. And yes, this is really about trusting God and what that does for us like it did for them. And the writer of the book of Hebrews, I think, made this message really clear. In chapters 3 and 4, he quotes one of David's Psalms, no less than 3 times, warning the Israelites against hardening their hearts against God. Now, that passage is about what the people did after the Exodus when they rebelled against God. But the analogy to what we've been talking about seems to work very well. Let me read Hebrews 3 starting in verse 7. And again, this is quoting Psalm 95. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion during the time of testing in the desert, where your fathers tested and tried me and for 40 years saw what I did. That is why I was angry with that generation. And I said, their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. I put that in terms of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Had they heard God's voice? Certainly they had through Moses and Aaron. Were they testing and trying God, even though they were seeing what he could do? And certainly after the first couple of miraculous events. And did he display his anger and condemn them for their unbelief? Sure. So the Hebrews message from this, as applied to Christians, is really those next 2 verses. See to it, brothers, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage one another daily, as long as it's called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. Now, in addition to what this says as individuals, I want to throw in one last thought here, and that's about mass psychology. The more people who believe a lie, the easier time they have sustaining it, and the harder it is to change their minds. I mean, just look at today's politics by social media. The group reinforces each other, and the more hardened they become against rethinking a situation. And in the long run, that's generally not a good thing. Pharaoh and his officials were all agreed at the beginning of this whole thing. They had it all figured out what they should do. On the other side of that coin, the more we encourage each other in truthful and godly thinking, the less likely it is we're going to harden our hearts against that truth. I think we're out of time, or we ought to be. So I'm going to have to save all the rest of this for some other time. I think we will stop there. Second bell hasn't quite rung, but that's partly because the second bell doesn't work. So we'll stop there. Oh, it did work. No, I think that's wrong. That's not it working. Okay, thank you very much for your participation. Took me up for a minute there. I thought it was a miracle.
Someone's just pressing it. Oh, it's about time.
Because it was right on time.
They look at their watch and say,
Stories.
Which
We were out in front of this week, so what exactly does it entail? But in terms of like responsibility or things like that. Well, I just didn't know, like, what, am I now like liable for things? Is there a legal implication?
As long as that's what good morning. I just Marcy. Continue great frequency. Both these two. Okay. Celebrate. Oh, good. We're celebrating. To my knowledge, there's no legal here.
You don't assume that you're legal liability. Which I'm not.
Good morning. Good morning, Michael. All right, good. Yes. I got in my head. Remember. Good morning, Johnson. Good morning. Good. John Whip. How well am I?
He might not. Yeah.
Thank you. No
So
problem.
unless you change the bylaws.
Yeah. Well, you call it.
Both times?
Last time.
No, I understand that. It's not unfortunate. That wasn't, so that's so still the first one. That's not that.
Yeah. Anyway, that's all I know about. Month of September, I have to go online, actually.
Yeah,
Fill
that
out
too.
That's it.
I know you.
Yes, I suppose that's true.
That's Dubai.
Great power, great responsibility. All right, yeah, no worries. We can do that. And I always appreciate it. Interesting. I'll tell you.
Yeah.
To me, it's like, This is the breath of fresh air.
You must get involved.
A part of it that I think is good.
Yes, it's
Like
very.
black keys.
Because at the end of the day, everything can get fair church is because of tradition of sexuality. Right now, we have it. Here's the path. Here's also. What is this?
Stacked up.
Oh,
You're still screaming.
sorry.
Sometimes